Hello, I am Lisa Garg, and I'm with my colleague, Dr. Heather Schmitt. We are here today to present on job interviews, how to conquer your anxiety and perform. We both practice at Thriving Minds Behavioral Health in Michigan, a pediatric psychology clinic dedicated to providing exceptional evidence-based behavioral treatment for selective mutism and related anxiety issues. We both frequently provide behavioral consultation and education to school-based professionals, caseworkers, and mental health providers to promote the success of individuals with selective mutism. This webinar is brought to you by the Selective Mutism Association and was made possible thanks to a generous grant from the Gordon and Marilyn Macklin Foundation. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on the Selective Mutism Association's YouTube channel within 24 to 48 hours. A link to the recording will also be sent to every registrant later this week. You may ask questions via the Q&A feature. And also, if you ask questions and you want to be anonymous, there is an option to do that when you go to put in your question. SMA's next webinar for individuals with selective mutism, Anxious Self-Advocacy for Individuals and Teens with Selective Mutism, will take place on January 26th. A registration link will be in the chat. So I'm going to begin by discussing how to prepare for job interviews in a way that reduces anxiety. Pretty much everyone feels anxious about going for a job interview. This is a great example of a situation where anxiety is normal and expected. However, for teens and young adults with selective mutism, the anxiety experienced before and during the job interview can be intense. We're not going to be able to make that anxiety go away because, again, even people without social anxiety or selective mutism experience anxiety with job interviews. However, we're going to learn ways to prepare so that way you can feel more confident about managing your anxiety during the interview and being able to successfully complete an interview despite the anxiety. So the first thing to do is to prepare for some basic logistics. Some of these you can prepare for now, and some you'll have to prepare for once you've actually lined up an interview. Writing a resume. This is important for young adults who've had a job before or who have been to college, or anyone interviewing for a professional job. It's less appropriate for teens who are applying for their first job unless they have done a lot of community service, belong to clubs that give back to the community or things like that that they could put on a resume. You do want to prepare some references and have some non-personal references. So you don't want to use your parents or best friend as a reference. Think about a favorite teacher or some school staff, a professor if you're in college, a coach, a previous employer if you do have one. And then if you've completed jobs for another family, things like babysitting or mowing the lawn, walking the dog, house sitting, those are also people that would be great to list as references. Research the company and the job description. So you want to know things like what are their values and mission statement? What are the job responsibilities and how do you qualify? If you're applying to a more professional job, and you know the interviewer's name, then you could look them up on LinkedIn. Not something that would apply so much for a teen applying for a job. You also want to know where you're going to be going. Be prepared for like having the address, look up how you would get there, think about when you would need to leave and consider in traffic, know where you'd be meeting the interviewer once you get there, and then decide on the outfit. Preparing for questions. So we can't prepare for all possible questions, but there are some standard questions you're more likely to be asked that it would be very helpful to prepare answers for. And also keep in mind that employees are looking for people who are on time, hard workers, willing to learn and do what's needed for the job, intelligent, loyal, and excited about starting the job. So discuss how you have these qualities when you're describing yourself. Really, really common one, tell me about yourself, or some version of that. They want to know who you are and what you're like. So you want to discuss things here that would make you seem like a good worker and a good fit for the job. Some things that you could include, any prior work history, school interests, successes, any awards or honors that you've had, any kind of leadership roles, whether that's in school or within a sport or club, appropriate personal interests and passions. What I mean by this is, for example, let's say you're applying at a pet store or the Humane Society, and you love animals, like that would be an appropriate personal interest to share with them. Projected career path, or where you see yourself in 5 years. For teens, you may not really know yet what you want to do after high school, and that's okay. But try to give like some kind of idea of where you think you're going to go in the future. What are your strengths? That is a very common question as well. You want to list strengths that will make you seem like a good fit for the job. So it's helpful to refer back to the job description, see what type of requirements they're looking for, and then think about if you have any strengths that would make you a good fit. You can think about compliments that trusted adults have given you, or if you can't remember any, go to the trusted adults in your lives and ask them what they see as your strengths. Some other things that, if these are your strengths, would be helpful to list, things like being a good rule follower, good organizational skills, punctual, all things that most companies are looking for. Also, along with what are your strengths, they usually ask, what are your weaknesses? This can be a hard one to have to talk about, so very helpful to prepare for. You want to think, and again, be honest, think about weaknesses that you do have, but also list weaknesses that can be turned into a positive or won't negatively impact the job. So you don't want to say something like, I am always late for things. That's not something they're going to want to hear. So for example, you might say something like, you tend to get caught up in details, if that's true for you. Or you can say that you tend to be quiet in social situations due to social anxiety. But this also means that you're going to be the last one to cause drama. So that would be an example of something that may be a weakness, but also it's not going to negatively impact your ability to do the job.
And can I add something to Lisa about that weakness?
Yeah.
I think too, like the one about like having social anxiety, so maybe being quiet in a situation. I think it's also good to throw in like if it's something you've been working on or improving at. So like, and that's something I've taken steps forward. You know, I've worked really hard to put myself out there a little more or speak up more, and I'm continuing to work on it. So you can kind of talk about any growth and continuing to address it too.
Absolutely, that's a really good point. Thank you. So some other questions that you can prepare for, a question such as, why do you want this job? Answer honestly, but also in a way that sounds responsible. So don't answer, my parents are making me. That's not going to be a helpful one, but things like, I'm saving money for college, or I want to build up my experience and resume outside of school. I've heard a lot of positive things about this job or this company. I think I will enjoy the responsibilities involved with this job. Most people are going to want someone, an employee who wants to be there. A question, why should we hire you? Again, speaking to your strengths that apply to the job description and the requirements that they listed. And some other things that you might say, I'm talking about, like if you're a hard worker and how you can be counted on to fulfill the job responsibilities. If you're a quick learner, so even if you don't necessarily have experience in whatever type of job you're applying for, if you're a quick learner, then that can definitely speak to a strength for being hired. And then saying something like, you know, it's important for you to be able to meet expectations and put in your best effort. Another question would be, how would you handle conflict with a coworker? Now, most people with selective mutism avoid conflict like the plague, right? We know this. And you can be honest about your tendency to avoid the conflict, meaning you're probably not going to get a whole lot of conflict in work. But also think of what type of assertive response you would push yourself to have if you did find yourself in conflict within the workplace. So you might say something like, due to my social anxiety, I tend to avoid making conflict in social situations. However, if I found myself in a conflict with a coworker, I would try to work through it with my coworker and only bring in a supervisor or manager if we weren't able to resolve it and it was impacting my ability to do my job. You might also get a question such as, how are you with working on a team? So again, many people with selective mutism have difficulty with working on a team due to the verbal demands of being on a team. So you want to be honest, but focus on the positives. So for example, I tend to be quieter in group situations such as teams. However, this also means that I stay focused on getting my part of the work done rather than getting caught up and distracted in the chit chat. It's also common to be asked for how you've handled certain situations in the past. So you want to kind of prepare ahead of time some personal examples of the following common situations that you may be asked, such as a time you had a disagreement with an adult, had to lead something, made a mistake, overcame a challenge, didn't feel heard, witnessed something you knew was wrong, worked on a team. So these are some common ones. And one such as like overcame a challenge, this would be a great time to kind of pull in an area that you might be working on with your selective mutism and the work you've put into being able to overcome that or work through it to get to a place where you're not able to apply for a job, because that is a great strength that takes a lot of work. And you want to make sure that when you give the example, you're focusing on how you handled the problem, if it's about a problem, and then also the positive traits that you exhibited in the situation. Now, if they ask for a personal example of a situation that you honestly have not been in before, say that, but then maybe say what you would imagine that you would do if you came across a situation like that on the job. You also want to prepare for your own questions to ask at the end of the interview. So this shows responsibility and taking the job seriously, coming with questions prepared. So just an idea of some questions that you might want to ask. What does a typical day of work look like? If I were to get the job, what hours can I expect? Is the job flexible with scheduling around school and sports commitments? What is the starting pay range? When do you need someone to start? Do you know when you'll be making a hiring decision? All right, so really want to do a whole lot of practice. Oh, actually, I'm sorry, before I get to the practice piece, we want to first also practice with making impressions with the introduction and conclusion. So this is one to be practicing as well, like how you're going to introduce yourself and how you're going to conclude the interview. So for the introduction, you want to introduce yourself first and last name and in a clear voice. So it is not at all uncommon for people with selective mutism to have anxiety about saying their name. So you want to practice this in the mirror, practice it with other people of being able to introduce yourself, give that solid, confident handshake, make eye contact, polite smile, and say your name in a clear voice. And then also saying something in the beginning, such as, thank you for meeting with me to consider me for this position. And then for the conclusion, similar, saying something like, thank you for your time. I look forward to hearing from the company soon. Giving that solid, confident handshake. And again, the eye contact and polite smile. And then you want to follow up the next day. You can follow up with an email. I think that's most common nowadays, though in some situations it might be appropriate to do a phone call. And just simply thank them for their time and express appreciation for being able to interview for the job. All right, so now on to more practice. Practice is huge beforehand. Preparing for what you might actually say is helpful, like going through those possible questions and write out how you would answer it. Definitely helpful, but I would say actually practicing is arguably even more important because you can't predict exactly what will be asked. So the questions you prepare for might not be the ones that are actually asked. However, if you role play the interview and you role play all of the interview skills, you're going to be able to feel more confident answering questions, even if they're not the ones that you had prepared an answer for. So for those who have done exposure therapy work to help with selective mutism, you're probably pretty familiar with the concept of creating a fear ladder or hierarchy. The basic concept is about progressively working towards a challenging goal by creating small steps of increasing difficulty. So the same idea can be used for getting to a challenging goal of talking and presenting yourself confidently in a job interview. Now, everyone's ladder might look a little different, just like exposures for selective mutism, but on the slide, I have some ideas of some different steps that you could take to work from easier up to the real deal. So first, I would recommend doing mirror work. This is where you are standing in front of a mirror and you're talking to your reflection to work on body language and eye contact, and then rate of tone and tone of voice. And then record yourself doing this and answering questions, and then watch your recording afterwards to see where you might need to improve. Then you want to start doing some mock interviews. You can first do a mock interview with a trusted and comfortable communication partner. So it might be a parent or a close friend or sibling, or maybe a favorite teacher that you feel really close and comfortable with. Now, you can jump right into the realistic mock interview, but if that feels too hard, there's also ways of breaking this down into further steps. So for example, you could start out where you're using a script that isn't even about yourself. So you could have the other person write down some questions and some like common answers to those kinds of questions, and then you're just reading the script. And then the next step would be you're using a script again. So think of all the questions we went over, like you have a script with those questions and then underneath your personal answer. So the difference with this one is your answers are your own, that you're putting down your answers ahead of time. The next step could be that you don't use a script, but you're sticking to the prepared questions. So you already know what's going to be asked of you, but you're not reading from a script. And then the next step would be where you're not using a script, and then also the person that you're doing the mock interview with has the freedom to ask the questions in the way they want. So it might not be worded exactly as you prepared for, and then also putting in some unexpected questions that you didn't prepare for. This is really important to do during a mock interview because you want to be able to practice handling the discomfort when you're unsure how to answer a question. So practice sitting with some silence and indicate that you need some time to think. This is important because when people are really anxious, sometimes the silence can kind of turn into like kind of uncomfortable silence where you might stop making eye contact. And with the interview, you want to push yourself to give some nonverbal cues that you are thinking, or even say something to them like, that's a great question. Let me think for a minute about my answer to that. And then if you really cannot think of how to respond to a question, if it's one that is very different than what you've prepared and your anxiety goes up where your mind kind of goes blank, then you can default to saying something like, I'm honestly not sure how I want to answer that question right now, but can I think about that and email you later with my answer? That's kind of a possibility if you need to go there. So then after you've done that mock interview with someone you're very comfortable with, you want to do a mock interview with someone who you know, but you're less familiar with. So this might be a family friend or maybe a teacher who you know, but not super comfortable with. So again, you can jump right into the realistic mock interview, or you can break that down into the same steps that I listed previously. And then after that, you want to do another mock interview, but this time with someone that you don't know. So asking your parents or friends if there is like someone they know who would be willing to do this with you, or going to the school counselor and asking if there is a teacher, another staff member who you are not familiar with, who you haven't had in class, who would be willing to do this with you. You want to treat this one like a dress rehearsal. So wear what you're going to wear for the actual interview. And it's best for this one to jump right into the realistic mock interview. However, if when you get to this point, that is still too hard and you don't think you'd be able to do that yet with someone you don't know, you can follow the steps previously listed as far as like using the script and then working towards not a script and unexpected questions. However, you're going to want to do each of those steps with a different person. Otherwise, by the time you get to that final step of not using a script and having unexpected questions, the person then wouldn't be completely new. So that's kind of everything about the practice, and all of this practice and preparation is really going to go a long way in helping you feel more confident and less anxious for the job interview. However, it certainly is not going to rid you from the anxiety that everyone, especially those with selective mutism, feel in interviews. So on that note, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Schmitt, who will discuss how to cope more effectively with distress before, during, and after the interview process.
Yeah. 1 second, everyone. I'm going to share my part of the slideshow. Give me a moment to adjust it. Perfect. Okay. So like Lisa was saying, and she's provided you a lot of good ways to prepare, really nice roadmap, right? To like feel your best going into an interview. But even if you do all of those things, there's going to be anxiety. And like Lisa was saying at the beginning, it doesn't have to be a complete sabotager or it doesn't have to be the enemy. There's ways to get through it in terms of the interview, and also just the process so that you're feeling and doing your best. So I'm going to kind of go through different ways to hopefully be able to manage any of that distress. Kind of broke it down as before the interview, during the interview, and then after the interview process. That said, before I kind of go through the individual strategies, this is not an exhaustive list. This is not every possible coping tool that would fill many, many webinars. And another caveat is, even though I kind of broke them down as before, during, and after the interviews, there's some that I put in a spot that you might think, oh, maybe that'd be helpful before. You're probably right. So use these divisions as like a guide or ideas, but it's not like a hard line of when you have to use it or where it might be helpful. So starting with some of the before the interview coping tools, the first is just an important reminder to yourself that feeling stressed or anxious about the interview is truly a sign that like you want to do well and you care about it. Right, we know anxiety can cross a line, but it also can motivate us to do all the preparing, and it can even keep us more alert while we're preparing or during the interview. If we had no anxiety, it would actually be detrimental. We might not prepare at all, or we just show up and hope for the best. So I think that reminder that it's also a signal that it's important to you and that you're ready to go. Another way to cope before the interview is really reflecting on all those preparations, right? I think it's easy to kind of push that aside and get into the what ifs, but with all of those things Lisa outlined, and hopefully you can incorporate into your preparing, right? Think about much like a runner who's training for a marathon, and they don't just show up for the marathon, right? They did a lot of training ahead of time, and then they're confident going into the big race. I mean, think of an example of someone you really respect who did a lot of preparing or working on something, and then, did their best at the outcome, even, practicing their instrument and doing a bunch of rehearsals for a big orchestra performance, right? It's exactly what you are going to do or what you did, right? You trained yourself for this thing. You organized your resume, you researched the place, you practiced your questions, all of those great things that were talked about before. And as you're able to kind of like embrace the preparing you did, that should breed some confidence. So kind of throwing in that statement and really identifying specific things that you're ready for and specific preparations you made, right? So like, I'm ready to arrive because I scoped out last week where to park and where to walk. I'm ready to learn more about the job because I prepared a question ahead of time about what training looks like. So you can build that confidence for yourself by reflecting on all the work you put in and doing it in a really intentional way. Another aspect is really reframing some of those anxious thoughts. And I went ahead and kind of categorized these into 3 types of reframes. So the first one is the idea of reframing what that anticipation is, right? So when anxiety shows up, there's a lot of nervous energy, we feel it in our body, but we can actually relate that same physical feeling into the feeling of excitement. So, instead of saying I'm beyond nervous for this interview, I'm too anxious, it's I'm excited for this interview. It's really cool. There's a lot of new research kind of suggesting that if we tie these anxiety feelings to excitement, there's actually an edge in performance in really stressful situations, including interviews. So that reason why, right, that physical anxiety experience there's a fine line between that and the feeling of excitement. So your body can't easily tell it apart, which means your brain can be kind of swayed to believing it's one or the other thing. So, right, if you can kind of choose and attribute it to excitement, that's actually going to work to decrease some of the anxiety. So really stay open to that possibility. You're feeling excitement. It'll really benefit the coping. Another way to think of a reframe would be reframing the interview process. It's really easy to think of it as, okay, this interview is them, grilling me, asking me all these questions, and it's this big competition between me and everybody else. Yes, the reality is it's an interview, but it's not just about them interviewing you. It's a two-way street. It's also a chance for you to really learn more and see, is this the kind of place I actually want to work or I want to be, right? Does the culture kind of align with my values? Is what they're offering for pay matching my experience? When I'm meeting people or talking about or hearing about the job, do I get the sense this place is pretty cooperative and everyone works together, or it's hyper competitive? All of that is stuff you'll learn at the interview, or you can learn at the interview. So remind yourself that the process is also you getting what you might need to either accept or not accept a job. A final reframing sort of thing has to do with those negative predictions, right? So anxiety loves to go, what if, assume that it's going to be the most miserable, terrible experience of our life, right? Like, this interview is life or death. I have to get the job. My family and friends will be so upset if I don't get it. So the idea of taking a moment to kind of challenge some of those and ask yourself, is that really true? Is that the fact, or does it feel like that's true? So, right, the fact is this interview is one opportunity. It's not the only one I'm ever going to have in my life. People will still be proud of me because I did an interview and I have all this anxiety. Like, people are still going to be proud, maybe just like that one time, like they were proud of me for trying something new, even though I didn't do good at it or I didn't like it. Right, really buffer those negative thoughts that can lower the arousal, calm that anxiety down. Another pre-interview way to cope is physical exercise. This can seem really counterintuitive, right? Why would I get my heart pumping more when I'm already feeling anxious? But the idea is, when we do physical exercise, it really does end up relaxing our bodies. It releases endorphins, those feel-good chemicals. So while you're preparing for the interview, obviously do your diligence of focusing on that, but, build in time to, wake up and go for a walk or go for a run or go to the gym if that's what you do. Even just build, I'm going to do 20 jumping jacks and just get my body moving for the day if I've been sitting all day. Or, I'm going to put on this album and do 3 songs worth of a dance party, whatever it is, something to physically exert yourself a little bit will actually be beneficial and calm things down. Some more before the interview strategies, and then I'll talk about during the interview itself. So using visualization or kind of imagery about a desired outcome. I kind of want to reference a research study that I find really cool that it talks about the power of visualization, only because as some of you might be like kind of skeptical. I know I'm always skeptical, like really imagining something is going to make it happen, like whatever, that seems like BS or something, right? Like, I don't know about that. So just to kind of show you the power of visualizing, there was a really cool study, and it's been kind of replicated in different ways, where people were assigned to 2 groups, and each group got their arm casted. Their arm wasn't actually broken, they just casted them up. And for a few weeks, they had people for 10 minutes a day or 15 minutes a day, I don't remember the exact amount, either just, sit there and do something mindless, like read an article. So half the people did that. The other half of the people were told during those 10 or 15 minutes, I want you to imagine using your arm. Visualize picking up a heavy weight. Visualize bending it back and forth, doing push-up, right? They were encouraged to actively visualize using it. So fast forward a few weeks later, the casts come off and they measure everyone's like hand and wrist strength. And they found the people that spent those 10, 15 minutes a day visualizing using their arm, they couldn't actually do it, but if they visualized it, their arms were significantly stronger than the people who didn't visualize. So just like, that doesn't mean, right, we can visualize running a marathon without training for it, but in small ways, kind of focusing our mind on that outcome we want can be really powerful. So very similarly, it can calm your anxiety and make it more likely if you visualize a successful interview. So imagine yourself in the interview room, making a good impression. Imagine that confidence you feel because you get a question, you answer it to the best of your ability. Think of those positive feelings that could come, and then that burst of confidence will come with it. Right? Imagining shaking their hands at the end and walking to your car, like feeling okay, getting the business card. And even visualizing how you feel immediately afterward, right? After the interview, regardless of how it goes, thinking about how calm you're going to feel, how proud of yourself you're going to feel. You maybe haven't done this before, or it's your first main job interview. So really use that visualizing and realize it can be a powerful tool. Another one before the interview can be some positive self-talk. So I want to emphasize, this is not meant to be, right, this like delusional talk of I'm going to go into the interview and make no mistakes and answer every question perfect and get the job and maybe get extra money than right? We're not looking to be delusional or dishonest with ourselves. But think about, right, how would I, talk to a friend going into an interview and be kind to them while also being supportive? Do the same thing for yourself. So if I'm, talking to myself about the interview, I can get through this and do this. I'm good enough to get through it. I'm qualified for this job. I got the interview. I'm ready for the challenge, right? You can keep it really realistic, but positive, promoting a good outcome. Can even be talking more positively about the preparing, right? Like, oh, I have to do that mock interview again today, right? That maybe starts like a negative spiral. Instead, you can kind of frame it as like, I want to get ahead on my prep tonight. If I get that done, then I can like relax more tomorrow. So kind of just work really hard to challenge some of those negative thoughts. Another really helpful strategy when we're feeling distressed or any emotions are overwhelming or right, like a situation is intolerable, is self-soothing and using our 5 senses. They can give us, some really needed respite and pleasure and comfort when we're feeling really overwhelmed. So think about each of your senses and, try to pick something to mindfully do that's related to it. So seeing, maybe I'm going to, look through this book of artwork that's sitting on my coffee table and pay attention to all the different colors I see. I'm going to just watch the snow hitting the trees outside my window. If I'm doing listening, I'm going to listen to some really relaxing music that I enjoy, or maybe even just going to listen to all the sounds of like people walking around the house and the chatter, just kind of take a few moments to really plug into my sense of hearing. Smell, right? Smelling your favorite meal cooking or lighting a candle that you like. For taste, tasting your favorite treat or a drink you really enjoy and really savoring it. And then touch would be the last one, right? So So petting your dog and really noticing the sensations and the relaxing effect it has, sinking into your, your comfy blanket and cozy pajamas. All of those sensing things are incredibly soothing if we can really focus on them and embrace them. Another thing to do before the interview is power posing. So what I mean by that is like standing tall and proud and confidently, hands on the hips, kind of like that superhero pose. I know it sounds absolutely ridiculous and silly, but it works. And there's a pretty big body of research to support this power pose idea. Some more recent research, because I think this is just really interesting and then makes it more likely to do something that feels kind of silly, right? But the idea is like they have found by actually looking at levels of stress hormones and like confidence hormones that doing power posing led to more significant drops in cortisol, which is the stress hormone for people, while increasing testosterone, which is kind of this like dominance hormone. I'm ready to go. I feel prepared. It like can change your body chemistry, which is pretty cool. And they've even done the power pose in studies with, specifically job interviews. And people who did the power pose before they went into the interview were actually chosen more often or considered more hireable. So, right, I think it seems so silly, but like all of these other strategies, there's evidence for it. And right, that nonverbal way of presenting ourselves and feeling our body can really impact how we feel, and then in turn, what we do or how we think about ourselves. Another way to cope kind of going into an interview can be really getting some of those anxious, overwhelming thoughts on paper. So, right, anxiety loves to make the brain spiral, spin. So making a list or jotting down or typing, whatever you prefer, even just saying it, out loud into a recording, those things that are popping into your head can be really therapeutic. And it can kind of reduce some of that anxiety, whether it's about interviews or other stuff. So at times, just getting it out of our head, like what I call like a brain dump, just doing the brain dump is cathartic. Okay, I'm no longer just holding it all in. It's out on paper, it's out in the world, and that feels good. You don't necessarily have to deeply reflect on it and pick it apart. But, it also can be a good opportunity if you have written it down and you want to maybe challenge some of those more negative thoughts that showed up a lot as you were writing, right? That reframing I kind of talked about before. I will say this can be a really helpful strategy, closer to bedtime, if that's when you find your anxiety really ramping up, the thoughts are spiraling, write those things down. But at the same time, you want to kind of limit it, right? If we just let it roll and we just ruminate, and we could probably think nonstop about the interview anxiety and all of those worries and what ifs. So if you are doing it, closer to bed or later in the day, shut the notebook, put it aside after 15 minutes and, go to one of those self-soothing activities or something that's going to be more calming, really kind of set a limit to how much time you're spending doing it. And then the last one for going into the interview is kind of consider your fuel. Okay. What are you putting into your body before the interview? So this is kind of like the day or two before the interview and even the morning of. Be really careful like what you're eating or drinking. Avoid caffeine the night before. It's going to mess with your sleep. You're already going to probably be feeling a little on edge and, a little bit of that anticipation building, and really avoid caffeine right before the interview. Even if you're someone who always has their Monster Energy drink in the morning or your big cup of coffee, right? You're already going to have some jitteriness and adrenaline. So you don't want to add a ton on top of it. You're kind of going to have your own caffeine going. It's also never a good idea to have like an alcoholic drink before an interview, even if it's like, oh, it's going to relax me or take the edge off. Not recommended. One thing that is recommended related to food is do eat something before. You don't want your stomach growling. You don't want to be lightheaded because you haven't eaten. So make sure you eat something light, at least a little bit. Not a heavy meal, right? Don't go to a big breakfast buffet. It's going to make you kind of tired and sleepy. So moderate, but definitely eating something is really important. So now that was all before the interview. Now we're thinking of during the interview, some of the things that might be beneficial. The first is that very classic deep mindful breathing. I'm sure you've heard of or tried different breathing techniques, right? This is a tried and true method, though, in terms of slowing the heart rate, decreasing anxiety, feeling more centered, right? You can be doing this in the parking lot. You can be doing this as you're sitting out in the lobby, during the middle of the interview. I think it's one of the simplest, and it's also for that reason really easy to completely forget about it, right? But you're always breathing, you always can reference it. So I encourage you, if you're in an interview, as soon as you sit down, like that is your step one. You get in your interview, you sit down, you pause, and you take a deep, mindful breath. Like have that be the first thing on your agenda so you don't forget to do it, right? Because anxiety leads to that shallow, quick breathing, which can make it harder to talk. It can make our body language more difficult. So definitely, at least do it right when you sit down and continue to notice it. In terms of this, there's lots of techniques out there. So find what works for you and keep trying things on until they work. For some people, it's more of that like strict counting kind of method to get through the breath. It's like, okay, I'm in for 4, hold for 7, out for 8. Or, it might be something much more simple. Like I'm just going to focus on exhaling slowly, because if I do that, then I'm going to slow everything down versus counting to a certain number. Whatever approach for it, just embrace that one. The next coping tool is thinking about your body temperature. I know, again, this is gonna be one that sounds a little strange, but one thing that can really decrease your heart rate is changing your body temperature. And it can decrease the intensity of an emotion really quickly. What this is tied to is something called the dive reflex. This is something all mammals have. And what happens is as a mammal submerges itself into cold water, so think of like a polar bear diving into the ocean and going deep. As they submerge themselves in that cold water, the dive reflex activates the parasympathetic nervous system. So what that is that's like that system in your body that slows everything down and conserves your physical systems. So it really counteracts that fight, flight, freeze, anxiety activated nervous system response. So that dive reflex, it's trying to bring you to resting heart rate or below. So of course, you're not going to be able to dive into a cold pool when you're at the interview. But I think of this being something, if you're really feeling those physical activated symptoms, you can, maybe you arrive at the interview early, you pop into the bathroom and run cold water over your wrist, or, splash a little really cold water on your face, dab it behind your ears or on your neck. Again, it's not going to be as powerful as if you were to dunk your whole head, but you're going into an interview, you're probably not going to do that. It can still really activate and start to shift that physical experience in a helpful way. Another way to cope during the interview and something to be doing to help with anxiety is really pacing yourself. When we're nervous, we tend to speed up our speech, talk much faster, right? We kind of create this urgency, or go, right? And then it's going to be harder to say what we want to say. And it also can just exacerbate some of the anxiety. So if you find yourself talking quickly, stumbling over your words, you're probably talking too fast. So before responding to a question, every single question, take a breath, give yourself a few seconds, and don't be afraid to pause. I think Lisa talked before about this, the pause can feel awkward and a lot. So give yourself time to think and slow down. This isn't a timed test. You could say those things that Lisa mentioned before, let me think about that, or good question. I want a moment to decide on the best example. Slow your pace so that you're less likely to ramp up anxiety. Another way to cope during the interview is to smile through the pain, right? No, but really, of course, you're going to want to smile and be friendly in an interview, but this is very similar to the power pose, where nonverbal gestures can really impact how we experience a situation. The same is true for an interview. So by there's a lot of research again, activating the smile muscles actually makes things feel more enjoyable to the person, even if they might not be doing something enjoyable. So there was a really cool study. They had people doing these like tasks that were really frustrating or incredibly boring on purpose. The people didn't realize that was the point. And there were two groups of people. So one group of the people just did the task and then that was it. The other group, while they did the task, had like a pencil in their mouth, right? So if we have a pencil in our mouth, we're activating our smile muscles without realizing it. Very interestingly, and this has been replicated, it's really cool. The people that were doing those really tough or boring tasks with the pencil in their mouth, smiling without realizing it, rated it as significantly more enjoyable. And the people who didn't have the smile activated found it less enjoyable. So the idea is smiling can be powerful, and noticing those muscles going and getting them going can actually increase your possibility of having some enjoyment or finding some peace during the experience. Another during the interview strategy is to turn your attention out. Okay, so let's think about what anxiety, social anxiety, selective mutism, right? It's a lot of being very focused on us and what we're doing. It could be like this like mega spotlight, right? On every small thing about us and how we're acting and what we're saying. So a really good way to cope can be to instead make it really a point to focus your attention on others or outward, the things around you. So, greet the receptionist. I'm gonna focus on them, or even waving friendly. I'm just gonna focus on, what outfits does everyone have on here? What do people wear to work? Focus outward. I'm gonna pay attention to other people's names and repeat them in my head over and over, right? Focusing out, shift the thoughts from my anxiety to the external world. Positive self-talk. I know we talked about this one. I'm bringing it back. During the interview, right? Again, how would you talk to a friend if you were sitting there during an interview and invited in? You're going to be supportive. You're going to be encouraging, and do the same for yourself. Remind yourself, I'm what this, company needs, and I have the skills needed. Remind yourself, I got this interview, which means they see something in me. Bring that back into during the interview. And then lastly, ask questions. I know Lisa spoke to this a little bit about, have questions ready and prepared. And a reason this is also kind of a coping tool is that anxiety can feel a lot worse when we feel powerless or things feel out of our control, right? And an interview, there is a lot that we do not have control over. So think about that two-way street, right? This is also a chance for you to ask questions, but by doing that, you kind of have some of the control back. It can feel kind of empowering. So another aspect though about questions that I want to say is always clarify. So this is kind of a way to cope and prevent anxiety from getting worse. If you're in an interview and they ask you something you don't understand or you don't know, like Lisa said before, it's really best to be honest. If you don't know what they're asking, or you've forgotten the question because you kind of were in your head a little bit, right? It's better to be honest and proceed from there versus pretending to know something or just giving a random answer that, leaves them confused and leaves you feeling more anxious. Definitely a way to cope is to embrace that opportunity to ask questions, and in a way that will decrease some anxiety in the long run. All right, so lastly, a few coping tools for after the interview. Treat yourself. Arrange for something afterward that you can look forward to and enjoy. It's something the whole time you can kind of have in your head and be like, all right, I can't wait to do this thing, see this person. So maybe it's, going to a nice meal with a friend or your partner, someone you trust, and make a plan to celebrate getting through an interview. And it should not be contingent on getting the job. So that's an important piece of this. Another cope after the interview is be self-compassion, right? We talked all about that. Self-talk, talk to a friend. Same applies after the interview, right? Acknowledge you did something difficult and you're on the other side, and be ready for that fact versus feeling, right? So maybe the fact is a question really caught you off guard and it was hard to answer and you felt like you fumbled on your words. But remember, like the fact too is now you know an example of a tricky question and it might happen again and you can prepare. Another way, when we're thinking of like some after the interview, we might be, starting to get really critical of ourselves or focusing on any negatives that happened or things that felt negative. Practice thinking dialectically. So what this means is use the word and think about both things that can be true together. So it can be true that I wished things had gone better, and also that some parts of the interview weren't as terrible as I was expecting. It can be true that it feels like I bombed that one question about what my weaknesses were. And, that skills test I had to do where they had me show computer programming or something, right? Like that was really easy for me. So think about both sides and embrace the and. Visualizing, I'm bringing it back right now, right? It can also be helpful after an interview to calm some of that anxiety by visualizing a successful outcome. Picture yourself getting the job and that possibility, that phone call coming in, that email. Really imagine just the pride and excitement you'll feel in that moment if you get the job. Another really great way to cope after an interview can be, taking some perspective and reminding yourself of those fit factors, right? So knowing an interview is as much about you learning about them and them about you. There are some important considerations. If you really feel like anxiety got the best of you in some ways, and oh no, that's going to cost me the job and or opportunity, I think there's some really good reflections here of, would I really want to work somewhere where they penalize someone for having anxiety? Okay, the answer is probably no, right? That's not the type of place where I'm going to be my best self or I'm going to be able to take care of my mental health. What does it say about a place where they focus negatively on my anxiety without paying attention to my skills and abilities, right? Again, just thinking about, even if there were moments that anxiety felt like it won, if that's why they don't give you the job, like, maybe not getting the job was dodging a bullet of daily overwhelm in a really unsupportive place. So trying to keep that perspective too about if anxiety is why it didn't happen, then maybe that's not what we should have had in the first place. Like it's for the best, honestly. And then a last one for coping after the interview would be seeking feedback, right? It can be really disappointing when you don't get a job. And at some point in your life, you're not going to get a job that you wanted, maybe, right? Like that sort of rejection really stings, but it's also really normal. So I think one thing that can sometimes be beneficial is asking that employer for feedback after, so you can grow from it, so you can be better prepared for the next one. You can also do your own reflecting, right? Oh, was there something they expected me to know that I didn't? So maybe I'll like seek out an opportunity. But at the same time, I think take the time to reflect on all those things you prepared, your resume, all that stuff, and like, okay, what made me strong enough of a candidate to interview, and reflect on those things as well after your interview is done. One last little note here is, with all of these coping tools, it's a lot. And, I don't expect all of them to be embraced, but I think you need to, I really encourage you to kind of try out and decide which ones might work best to manage your distress. Just like preparing for the interview itself, prepare to cope effectively. So I often will, create coping plans and break it down before, during, and after, and maybe pick three of the strategies. And I put some stars here, right? Maybe you find one that you really want to make sure you do no matter what. Give it some stars. You really liked that one. But remember, right, something isn't going to instantly be beneficial either. It's going to take practice. So just like Lisa emphasized with practice for the interview, practice these coping tools before, so that, you find what works for you and you're more ready to use it in the moment. And treat this like a living document. Cross stuff out, remove it, add it, as you kind of form the best coping plan for you. All right, so wanted to save the last few minutes here for any final questions. Feel free to pop them into the Q&A, and Lisa and I can do our best to answer those and address them. So give a quick minute for any final questions. Otherwise, just a reminder that next webinar is Anxious Self-Advocacy for Individuals and Teens with Selective Mutism. and that'll be on January 26th. So go ahead and you can look at that registration link in the chat, look it up and register if that's something of interest to you. All right. Well, thank you all so much for joining us on the webinar. And have a good rest of your night.